In the forgotten hills of rural Massachusetts lies a place most travelers avoid, a village whispered about only in half-broken stories and midnight warnings. Dunwich, silent, decayed, and shrouded in legends older than its crumbling stones, harbors a secret the world was never meant to witness. Strange lights burn atop lonely hills, grotesque echoes rise from beneath the earth, and a child unlike any other is born into a family already stained by rumors of forbidden rites. But what if the true horror is not what people see, but what they cannot? What monstrous presence stirs behind locked doors and boarded windows? What invisible terror roams the countryside, crushing houses and calling out for a father no human tongue should ever name? Tonight, we open the gates to the Dunwich Horror, a tale of cosmic dread, ancient forces, and the thin veil separating our world from the unimaginable. When a lone traveler wanders too far into north-central Massachusetts and takes the wrong fork at the Aylesbury Pike, just beyond the quiet junction of Dean's Corners, he may find himself entering a landscape that feels strangely older than the country it rests upon. It is a region where the hills rise like worn, slumbering giants beneath a gray sky, and where the road narrows as if reluctant to carry outsiders further. Here, the wind carries an unfamiliar chill, and the silence between the trees seems to listen more intently than it should. This is Dunwich, a place not marked merely by geography, but by a long, unsettling memory soaked into every stone and blade of grass. The ground begins to climb steadily, and dense walls of thorny underbrush press inward on both sides of the dusty road. The forests that flank the way do not resemble the tidy woodlots of New England farms. Instead, the trees grow impossibly tall, their trunks swollen and twisted as though nourished by something richer or more tainted than common soil. Even the weeds and wild grasses grow thicker here, vibrant yet somehow sickly, as though they thrive on a secret nourishment the land begrudgingly offers. Oddly, the cultivated fields are sparse, and those that remain are barren or poorly tended. The scattered houses, leaning, rotting, rooflines sagging under their own age, appear like abandoned relics. One cannot help but notice that even the inhabited homes feel unlived in, as though their owners are merely passing through lives not entirely their own. And though a traveler may glimpse a solitary figure lingering on a dilapidated porch or crossing a stony pasture, these locals are strangely silent. They watch warily, eyes dulled with suspicion or dimmed with ancient weariness, and their furtive glances carry a warning no one ever speaks aloud. It is then, before any true danger reveals itself, that a traveler feels the first shiver of unease. Something here is wrong, not in the dramatic way of storms or wild beasts, but in the soft, persistent way that a whisper becomes more frightening than a scream. One feels instinctively that this land has seen things, old things, that were never meant to be remembered, yet have refused to fade. As the road winds upward, the hills emerge fully into sight. Their shapes are too symmetrical, too rounded, as if molded by hands with unfamiliar intents. On their summits, tall stone pillars stand in circular formations. They are remnants of something ancient, though no record claims them, something ceremonial, though no living memory recalls their rites. When the afternoon sun strikes them just right, the stones seem to form primitive silhouettes against the sky, watching, waiting. Creeks, ravines, and chasms of questionable depth cross the path, compelling wagons and travelers to cross rickety bridges that creak with each hesitant step. Marshlands nearby exhale odors of rot and age, especially at dusk when whippoorwills begin their eerie, persistent cries. Their chorus rises unnaturally loud, converging into a single pulse of sound that echoes across the valley like a warning. Fireflies flicker with abnormal intensity, swirling in patterns that evoke more ritual than random dance, while bullfrogs chant in discordant rhythms that grow increasingly unsettling as night gathers. Along the river, the Miskatonic winds like a thin, luminous serpent, its pale waters gliding at the feet of the domed hills that cradle its source. The closer one comes to Dunwich, the darker the hills become, looming over the road like watchful sentinels. Their slopes are steep and thickly wooded, forming natural barriers that seem determined to confine whatever dwells within. At last, after the road dips toward a covered bridge, the village itself appears, a huddled cluster of decrepit gambrel roofs pressed tightly between the stream and the vertical slope of Round Mountain. Time has gnawed at its structures, leaving broken shingles, sagging beams, and the faint scent of rot drifting through the air. Even the church, once proud and central to village life, has surrendered to decay. Its steeple hangs crooked, and its sanctuary now houses a slovenly general store whose creaking signboard never stops swaying, even in still weather. Crossing the bridge feels like entering an unspoken boundary. A faint, almost imperceptible odor mold, decay, and something else far harder to identify seems to linger along the village street. Travelers rarely pause long enough to investigate. Instinct urges them forward, back toward the open road that eventually reconnects with the Aylesbury Pike, where sunlight feels warmer and the land seems less aware of their presence. Only after leaving the place does one hear the name whispered, Dunwich. For generations, visitors have avoided it, though few can explain why. 2 centuries ago, people blamed witchcraft, unnatural rites, or lingering spirits of vanished tribes. Today, most simply feel an unshakable reluctance to tread its soil. They need no stories to justify this fear. Dunwich itself seems to whisper its own warnings. Despite the scenic beauty, no artists set up their easels here, and no travelers take leisurely holidays. Something in the land repels them. Outsiders sense instinctively that Dunwich is isolated not only by geography, but by an invisible veil woven from secrets and ancient wrongs. The locals' descendants of old New England families bear unmistakable signs of decline. They are mentally dulled, physically distorted, and spiritually hollowed. The marks of inbreeding show, but so too does something deeper, unspoken, something in their eyes that suggests knowledge best left buried. Their oral histories, if pressed, speak faintly of rites performed before the settlers came, of shadowy shapes summoned from the hills, and of strange rumblings beneath the earth that continue to this day. Old sermons from vanished ministers warn of voices heard underground, speaking in tones no human throat could produce. Legends linger of whippoorwills who cry to capture escaping souls, of blasted hillsides where nothing grows, and of stone circles on the mountaintops where bones have been found, bones not easily classified by scholars. And yet, for all these tales, no one can say precisely what is wrong with Dunwich. But soon, very soon, the world will learn, for Dunwich hides a horror that is no mere ghost or superstition. It is something vast, ancient, and hungry, something awakening beneath the hills, and when it rises, no one will be able to pretend the village was simply a forgotten place on a dusty map. When one studies the history of Dunwich, the unsettling truth becomes clear. The place was not shaped by the passing of years, but by something older, something woven into the soil long before any settlement ever took root. Dunwich is a relic, an echo of a time when the hills themselves were considered alive, and when early inhabitants whispered prayers to unseen forces rather than to any known god. To wander into Dunwich is to step into a landscape where the past never died, but instead lingered, molding generation after generation into its own strange likeness. The earliest colonial records describe Dunwich as an isolated valley rich with game, creeks, and fertile slopes, yet the settlers who came here did not thrive. Families from Salem and the greater Massachusetts Bay region migrated inward after the witch trials, seeking solitude, anonymity, or perhaps a place to practice customs they dared not reveal elsewhere. Over time, the town grew not in numbers, but in deformity. Its buildings decayed even when newly built, its people aging with an odd heaviness, as though burdened by secrets of blood and earth. Visitors in the 18th century wrote about the unnatural quiet that hung over the valley, a quiet so dense that it seemed to absorb laughter and conversation before the sound could carry across the fields. Legends of earlier inhabitants, the Pocumtucks and other Algonquian tribes, speak of Dunwich as a forbidden zone. The tribes refused to hunt or camp near the tall stone pillars that crowned the hills, calling them places where the sky opens. Excavations uncovered rings of stones, their surfaces carved and worn in ways no natural weathering could replicate. Around them lay deposits of bones, human, animal, and some belonging to no creature known to natural history. Scholars from Boston argued whether these remains were ceremonial or merely misattributed. Yet the rumors persisted, weaving into the collective memory of Dunwich until the pillars became a silent warning to all who lived within sight of them. By the 19th century, Dunwich already bore the hallmarks of a community in decline. The mills at the falls, built with such optimism in 1806, fell into disuse within a generation, abandoned after strange tremors shook the valley. Farmers spoke of nights when their livestock shuddered without cause, when the hills emitted low, resonant rumblings that vibrated in the bones rather than the air. Children refused to play near Cold Spring Glen, claiming voices whispered from the depths of the ravine when twilight crept across the land. And in the darkened forests, whippoorwills gathered in unnaturally large flocks, their cries rising and falling in eerie synchrony, as though anticipating something the townsfolk could not see. As decades passed, Dunwich's population thinned, and those who remained were marked by unmistakable degeneracy. Their limbs grew crooked from birth, their features coarse and animalistic, and their minds clouded with lethargy. Families intermarried not out of preference, but out of necessity, further deepening physical and mental decline. Yet, more disturbing still was the sense that these deformities were not solely the product of inbreeding. Some faces bore shapes that seemed subtly inhuman, a curvature of the nose too sharp, an eye too round and dark, ears with an elongated tilt reminiscent of sketches found in occult manuscripts. It was as though the land itself had placed its imprint upon them, an ancient mold shaping flesh across generations. Outsiders rarely stayed long enough to question these abnormalities, for the people of Dunwich, though reserved, carried themselves with a wary defensiveness. Their voices were thick with an old dialect, their stares lingering too long, as though measuring whether a visitor might pry into matters best left undisturbed. In the taverns and stores, conversations ceased abruptly when strangers entered, and more than one traveler reported the uncanny feeling of being watched from windows as they hurried through the village. No signs pointed toward Dunwich from the surrounding towns. The residents had taken them down after a particularly dreadful incident in 1928, preferring that no curious souls drift accidentally into their troubled valley. Superstitions that had faded elsewhere in New England persisted stubbornly here. Tales of the Devil's Hop Yard, a barren, blasted hillside where nothing ever grew, were repeated with solemn certainty. Some claimed the ground there still bore scorch marks from rituals performed by early settlers or older beings entirely. Others spoke of the whippoorwills that flocked near dying men and women, waiting to seize departing souls. If the birds cried triumphantly, the soul was said to be lost forever. If they fell silent, the soul had escaped their clutches. Sensible folk dismissed these beliefs, but sensible folk rarely visited Dunwich. The Reverend Abijah Whateley, who preached in Dunwich in the mid-18th century, warned passionately of demonic presences beneath the hills. He reported hearing groans, rattling, and hissing from underground caves near his home sounds he insisted no earthly creature could produce. His sermon on this matter, written in archaic script and printed in Springfield, survives to this day. Shortly after its delivery, Whateley disappeared. Some say he fled the region in terror. Others whisper that the ground itself claimed him. His final words described cursed voices from beneath the earth, naming entities whose names do not appear in Christian demonology, but echo oddly with those later recorded in occult literature. Modern scholars attempted to study the geological oddities of Dunwich, but their instruments malfunctioned, and their measurements revealed anomalies in magnetic fields, soil composition, and subterranean acoustics. Some attributed the strange hill noises to shifting stone plates or underground water movement, but the explanations felt incomplete. The sounds did not resemble natural phenomena. They resembled whispers, movements, and at times, something like distant chanting. Even the wildlife behaved strangely. Dogs refused to approach the hills, growling at empty space. Horses panicked near the ravines, and at night, the whippoorwills, those small, unassuming birds, sang with a fervor that chilled the blood. Their cries rose and fell in patterns too deliberate, too synchronized, to be mere instinct. Historians, theologians, naturalists, all tried to categorize Dunwich. None succeeded. The village persisted as a kind of blemish on the map of Massachusetts, a place known yet unknown, feared yet forgotten, decaying yet somehow eternal. If there was an explanation, it lay not in the documents or geology, but in the living memory of the land itself. For beneath the soil, beneath the stones, beneath the whispered stories, something ancient stirred, something that had been called, once long ago, by those who lived before the settlers arrived, something that had never fully retreated. And soon, through the hands of the Whateley family and their dark inheritance, it would rise again. The house in which Wilbur Whateley was born stood alone on the slope of a steep hillside, 1.5 miles from the nearest dwelling and 4 miles from the village itself. Even in daylight, the place looked forsaken, its roof sagging beneath decades of neglect, its walls blotched with mold, and its windows clouded with grime, as though refusing to let the outside world peer in. Yet, despite its decay, the house possessed a certain heaviness, a sense that something within its walls listened and remembered. This was the Whateley homestead, a place shunned for generations and spoken of only in uneasy tones. The Whateleys had never been loved in Dunwich, not even in earlier times. Their lineage carried whispers of heresy and forbidden practices reaching back to the days when the first settlers pushed their way into the remote hills. The patriarch, known simply as Old Whateley, was a gaunt, half-mad figure with a tangled beard and eyes that seemed to hold both cunning and delirium. The villagers said he had once been clever, dangerously clever, dabbling in old books and strange rites that colonial ministers had long condemned. Some swore they saw him wandering the hills during storms, muttering in dialects no living man could name. But of all the peculiarities surrounding the Whateley family, none was more striking than Lavinia Whateley, Old Whateley's only daughter. She was an albino woman of 35, pale as chalk and oddly deformed, with pinkish, haunted eyes that rarely blinked. Her movements were gaunt and bird-like, as though she were perpetually drifting at the edge of some private dream. In her youth, Lavinia had been seen wandering the valleys during thunderstorms, carrying tattered books inherited from her father, trying to decipher languages neither she nor anyone else understood. Though uneducated, she possessed scattered fragments of ancient lore, pieces of knowledge passed down through generations of Whateleys, twisted and incomplete, yet potent enough to unsettle anyone who listened. The villagers tolerated her presence only because Dunwich was a place where oddness had become almost commonplace. Still, they kept their distance. Stories circulated about her mother, who had died in unexplained violence when Lavinia was 12 years old. Some said the death was an accident, others whispered darker theories, but none challenged Old Whateley, who had long been feared for reasons no one dared articulate directly. It was into this household, isolated, decaying, and steeped in shadows, that a child was born on Candlemas morning, the 2nd of February 1913. The night before had been filled with ominous signs. Throughout the valley, dogs barked and howled for hours without pause, and the hills vibrated with muffled rumblings that no storm could explain. The air carried an unnatural tension, as if the land itself were bracing for something it could not prevent. When dawn arrived, the sky over Dunwich hung heavy and dull, and the first cries of the newborn echoed strangely across the fields. Lavinia had no husband, No one in Dunwich believed she had ever courted anyone, and she made no attempt to deny the child's mysterious parentage. Instead, she seemed fiercely proud, speaking in prophetic tones about the infant's future, about great power and unseen bloodlines that would soon reveal themselves. When neighbors finally heard this talk, they shuddered, for such words from Lavinia were no mere fantasies. She spoke with a conviction that hinted at something she had been taught, something she believed fully, even if she did not entirely understand. People who expected the newborn to resemble Lavinia were startled by the stark contrast. The baby Wilbur was dark-skinned, black-haired, and strangely formed. Some said he looked goatish. Others simply murmured that he looked wrong. Yet the most disturbing thing was the sense that he was alert from the moment he opened his eyes. His gaze was too focused, too knowing for a child only minutes old. Old Whateley wasted no time taking control of the situation. Within a week, he appeared in Dunwich village, driving his sleigh through the snow with an air of secrecy and pride. His words were rambling, as always, but the villagers caught enough to deepen their unease. He implied that Lavinia's child had a father not from around here, someone powerful and ancient, and that one day Dunwich would hear the child calling out that father's name from the top of Sentinel Hill. Most dismissed his muttering as senile nonsense. Yet some, remembering tales of strange lights and chants heard from the hills over the years, felt a quiet dread settle in their bones. As weeks passed, only 2 people outside the household saw the child, Zechariah Whateley and Mamie Bishop. Mamie went purely out of curiosity and returned with stories that spread through Dunwich like wildfire stories of the child's unnatural appearance, of the strange smell in the house, of rooms locked away, as though something inside clawed at the walls. Zechariah, more reserved and of the more respected branch of the family, said little, but the tightness in his expression told more than words. Even more unsettling was the family's sudden need for cattle. Old Whateley began buying cows, many cows, yet the herd on the hillside never grew. Instead, animals seemed to vanish, their bloodless remains occasionally glimpsed before old Whateley could drag them away. Some whispered that the Whateleys were practicing old rites requiring animal sacrifice. Others speculated that something in the house was being fed. Then came the matter of the strange sores, the incisions seen on both the cattle and the Whateleys themselves. Dunwich residents were no strangers to disease among livestock, but these marks were unlike anything they had seen. Once or twice, visitors to the farmhouse claimed to see similar wounds on old Whateley's throat or Lavinia's arms, as though something sharp and hungry had pressed against their skin. By spring, Lavinia resumed her customary wanderings through the hills, now carrying Wilbur in her oddly proportioned arms. The villagers murmured, for the child was growing too fast, far too fast. Within 3 months, he was the size and strength of a 1-year-old. His movements were deliberate, almost studied, and his eyes held a maturity that made even the most hardened farmers turn away uncomfortably. Yet this was only the beginning, for as Dunwich watched from a distance, uncertain and fearful, the Whateley family continued their quiet preparations. Strange lights flickered on Sentinel Hill during sacred nights. Odd sounds drifted from the boarded rooms of the house, and old Whateley, ever muttering, ever plotting, kept repairing parts of the house no one was allowed to enter. Whatever future he foresaw for the child, one thing was certain. Wilbur Whateley had not come into the world as other children do. His birth marked the beginning of something ancient stirring once more beneath the hills, and Dunwich, already steeped in shadows, had only begun to learn the cost. Wilbur Whateley's growth in his first years of life defied every natural law known to Dunwich, or to any corner of the world for that matter. While other infants learned to sit, crawl, and babble in the expected gentle rhythm of childhood, Wilbur grew with the urgency of something trying to outpace time itself. Before he was even a year old, he had reached a size and strength equal to children 3 times his age. His muscles developed with uncanny precision, as though every fiber of his being was humming with a purpose predetermined long before his birth. Those who glimpsed him during those early months whispered of the strange deliberateness in his movements, Most babies stumbled, grasped at the air, or toddled without aim, but Wilbur walked, truly walked, with a steadiness that made onlookers recoil. His eyes followed everything with unsettling focus, dark orbs absorbing details that no infant should care to observe. It was as if he was studying the world, assessing it, measuring it against something known only to him and the decaying walls of the Whateley homestead. By the time he reached 7 months, his steps were sure and confident. Within another month, he roamed the hillside with Lavinia trailing behind him like a nervous shadow. Even she, who had birthed him in a night thick with omens, seemed startled by the creature her womb had carried. Still, her pride remained unshaken. She muttered prophecies of Wilbur's future, speaking as though she had been entrusted with knowledge that would one day transform not just Dunwich, but perhaps the world itself. The villagers were less enthused. They watched from afar as the boy darted across the pastures, his small body surprisingly swift, his silhouette oddly angular beneath the ragged clothes old Whateley insisted he wear. Dogs, normally bold and fiercely territorial in Dunwich, responded to his presence with primal dread. They snarled, barked, and often retreated, tails tucked, whenever Wilbur approached. More than once, old Whateley had to drive off hounds, desperate to keep distance between themselves and the uncanny child. It was around this time that an incident occurred, one that would embed itself in the collective memory of Dunwich. On Halloween night, a blaze erupted suddenly upon the summit of Sentinel Hill. The flames crackled in unnatural hues, tinged with green and violet, illuminating the ancient stone pillars as though some forgotten ritual had been rekindled after centuries of dormancy. Silas Bishop, returning home with a stray heifer, spotted 2 figures making their way up the hill just before the fire began. Even through the dim glow of his lantern, he recognized Lavinia's pale form. The smaller figure ahead of her, darting with uncanny agility, could only have been Wilbur. Silas swore afterward that the pair seemed unclothed, or perhaps only half-draped in garments that clung strangely to them. The boy appeared to move effortlessly through the tangle of brush, barely disturbing the branches as he climbed. For a fleeting moment, Silas thought he saw something unnatural about Wilbur's limbs, as though his joints flexed in ways not typical of human anatomy. But like many unsettling sights in Dunwich, Silas tucked the memory deep inside himself and spoke of it only when he felt compelled to do so. In the months that followed, changes in Wilbur grew even more evident. Old Whateley, who seldom showed emotion, grew protective over the boy, ferociously so. The old man repaired sections of the house, particularly the upper story, with obsessive diligence. He strengthened beams, boarded up windows, and installed locks so heavy that neighbors wondered if he feared someone breaking in or something breaking out. Lavinia continued her wanderings, but now she walked alone. Wilbur disappeared into the house for long stretches, and no visitor was allowed beyond the first floor. As the child's body grew, so too did his voice. Before he reached a year old, he began to speak clearly, articulately, without the lisping innocence of infancy. The words were plain enough, but the tone unsettled all who heard it. There was a resonance, a weight to his speech that suggested a maturity far beyond his years. When Wilbur did speak to others, it was rarely to share trivial thoughts. Instead, he asked questions that struck people as oddly advanced. "What lies beneath the hills?" he once asked Mamie Bishop. "Do you hear the voices at night?" She fled before he could elaborate. But Wilbur's strangeness was not limited to intellect and growth. His appearance hardened over time, revealing a mixture of human features marred by unsettling abnormalities. His hair, coarse and dark, curled in ways reminiscent of certain mountain goats. His lips were thick, his ears elongated, and his nose, unlike that of his chinless mother or grandfather, was sharply defined, giving him a visage both adult and animalistic. His skin was yellowish and pocked, his pores unusually large, and sometimes, when the sunlight fell just right, his eyes flashed with a depth that chilled the marrow. By age 3, though he looked closer to 10, The villagers had begun to openly avoid the Whateley homestead. Children cried at the mere sight of him. Grown men crossed themselves or mumbled protective charms beneath their breath. Dogs would not approach the path leading to the house. Something about Wilbur radiated an aura of wrongness, a subtle influence that made even seasoned farmers cling to their lanterns a little tighter at night. It did not help that on several occasions Wilbur was heard chanting in strange, rhythmic tones while wandering the hillside alone. The words were unintelligible to anyone who overheard, but they carried a cadence that reminded listeners of some ancient litany or forgotten hymn. These chants often coincided with nights when the hills rumbled and flares of dim, otherworldly light flickered above Sentinel Hill. The Whateley cattle losses continued and worsened. Night after night, villagers glimpsed old Whateley hauling the sickly carcasses toward the upper barn or into the woods. The rumor grew that the cattle were not merely dying, they were being fed upon, and the unspoken question loomed larger with each passing season. If something was feeding, what was growing? By the time Wilbur reached 4 years of age, even his speech grew sparse. He retreated further into himself, spending long hours studying the crumbling tomes old Whateley had collected. His taciturn nature made him seem older still, as though the weight of some unspoken destiny pressed upon him. Dunwich had witnessed strange people before, but nobody, not in living memory, nor ancient tales, had seen a child like Wilbur Whateley. Something ancient slumbered within him, something that pulled at him from the hills, from the shadows, from the very fabric of the world. And as Dunwich watched, trembling yet powerless, Wilbur Whateley stepped steadily toward the path that had been carved for him long before his birth, a path leading out of the human world and into the realm of the unspeakable. Sentinel Hill had always towered above Dunwich like a silent overseer, its summit ringed by those eerie, weather-scarred stone pillars that locals refused to approach. For generations, the hill had been the stage for strange lights, uncanny fires, and whispered rituals carried on by figures too distant to identify. But as Wilbur Whateley grew, these nighttime ceremonies, once sporadic and shrouded in the mysteries of older times, took on a new intensity. The hill seemed to awaken in tandem with the boy, as though responding to something it had long awaited. Throughout Dunwich, the villagers learned to fear certain nights, May Eve, Lammas, and most of all Hallows. On these evenings the air thickened, becoming unnaturally still, and the animals grew restless. Horses stampeded in their stalls, cattle moaned at invisible disturbances, and the dogs barked with such ferocity that even seasoned farmers felt their nerves fray. Always on those nights, when the moon was smothered behind low clouds, the flames on Sentinel Hill began to rise. Old Whateley was seen making his slow ascent before dusk, hunched beneath his ragged cloak, clutching his ancient books as though they were more vital than food or breath. Sometimes Lavinia accompanied him in those early years, though she walked with a distant, nervous air, as though she felt watched by eyes she could not see. And Wilbur, even as a small child, climbed behind them with unnerving grace, never stumbling, never hesitating, his movements smooth and purposeful like an adult retracing familiar steps. But what truly unsettled those who observed from afar was the way the strange trio seemed completely unbothered by the treacherous terrain. Sentinel Hill's slopes were steep and tangled with brush, yet they moved as though guided by invisible pathways only they could perceive. More than once, a villager glimpsed them silhouetted in a burst of lightning, 3 stark figures against the stone pillars before hurrying away, unwilling to see more. When the fires ignited at the summit, they burned with unnatural colors, deep green that shimmered like stagnant water, violet flames that writhed as though stirred by breath rather than wind, and pale white sparks that drifted skyward like souls escaping their earthly bindings. The sounds that accompanied these lights were even more troubling, chanting low, rhythmic, and harsh echoed across the valley, sometimes carried clearly by the wind, other times muffled and distorted as though absorbed by the very earth. Few dared to listen closely, but those who did felt the unmistakable pulse of something ancient in the cadence. The voices seemed to speak in a language older than Dunwich, older than the stone pillars, older even than the tribes who had once worshipped here. Some villagers claimed that the chanting did not belong entirely to the Whateleys, that beneath the human tones were deeper, resonant murmurs, as though something vast and unseen was responding from beneath the ground. On one particular All Hallows night, the disturbance grew impossible to ignore. The hills themselves seemed to groan, vibrating faintly in the bones of anyone awake to feel it. Lights flickered, not just on Sentinel Hill but along the ridges that framed the valley, as though answering signals passed between forgotten altars. Those who could not sleep pressed themselves beneath blankets, or clutched at charms handed down through family lore, praying for dawn. It was on that same night that Silas Bishop had seen Wilbur, still barely beyond infancy, running ahead of Lavinia at the hill's base. And it was later that night, when the flames burst unnaturally tall, that Dunwich first recognized the connection between the Whateley child and the timeless rituals. What had once been a vague unease solidified into fear. Something was happening on Sentinel Hill, something deliberate, something dangerous. Old Whateley's behavior in the following days did little to soothe the growing tension. He moved through the village with an odd mixture of urgency and triumph, speaking in cryptic tones about openin' the gates and prepperin' the place. His talk grew more frenzied with each passing year, especially as the mysterious renovations to the Whateley homestead advanced. He boarded up more windows, reinforced more beams, and cleared out forgotten spaces as though expecting something large and unwieldy to require room. Neighbors reported seeing him carrying strange bundles up the hill, objects wrapped in coarse cloth, animal remains, or perhaps relics from the locked rooms of the house. Others claimed to hear chants drifting from the hill even on nights when no fires burned. The dogs, whose senses were keenest, refused to go near Sentinel Hill altogether. Meanwhile, Wilbur's education accelerated rapidly. Guided by old Whateley's failing yet determined hands, he pored over the ancient books inherited from generations of their ancestors. Lavinia often watched from the doorway, her pale face troubled but oddly reverent, as though she sensed that her son's destiny was both monumental and beyond her control. The boy's ability to comprehend the archaic symbols and infernal diagrams shocked even the old man. Before Wilbur's 4th birthday, though, he looked nearly 10. He had memorized entire passages written in languages no scholar in the region could identify. And yet, it was not merely knowledge that Wilbur gained. The rituals on Sentinel Hill fused with something inside him, something dormant yet eager. Each ceremony seemed to nourish him in ways ordinary food could not. After particularly intense nights, he often appeared taller, more alert, or more physically defined. His eyes glowed with a deeper intelligence, an almost predatory awareness. The villagers noticed it too, though none dared speak aloud what they suspected. The truth was obvious to anyone who cared to see it. The rituals and Wilbur were intertwined. The boy was not merely a participant. He was part of the purpose, part of the design, part of the slow building towards something unimaginable. And Sentinel Hill, ancient, patient, steeped in forgotten rites, was preparing itself for that purpose as well. Even the weather seemed complicit. Storm clouds gathered on nights when the flames rose highest, though rain never fell until the chanting ceased. Strange winds whipped along the ridges, carrying the scent of charred herbs and something metallic. The earth shook at intervals that defied explanation, causing loose stones to rattle down the slopes. In the village, quiet as it tried to remain, dread began to ferment. People boarded their windows tighter on ceremony nights and avoided looking toward the hills after dusk. It was as though the entire valley sensed a tension slowly, steadily building toward an irreversible conclusion. What none of them could yet understand was that the rituals were not the climax, but the prelude. For each fire lit on Sentinel Hill, each chant murmured into the night, each step Wilbur took beneath the pillars, brought the valley one moment closer to the opening of something ancient, something that had slept far too long. As Wilbur Whateley continued his unnatural ascent in body and intellect, the whispers surrounding the old Whateley homestead grew more pervasive, spreading through Dunwich like a slow, creeping fog. Though the villagers often avoided speaking openly about the family, the signs around the farmhouse were impossible to ignore. Something within its weathered walls stirred, something that was growing, learning, and hungering. And each passing day made it harder for Dunwich to pretend that the Whateleys were merely eccentric. The house itself was undergoing a transformation under old Whateley's shaking hands. Long-abandoned rooms were being reclaimed, not for comfort, but for containment. The upper floor, once a drafty and useless space, became a site of obsessive repair. Boards were nailed across the windows from within, sealing out even the faintest sliver of light. Heavy doors, reinforced with new timber, creaked under the weight of unfamiliar locks. When asked about these renovations, old Whateley responded with vague and cryptic mutterings, hinting at things as needs room, growin' quicker than they should, and spaces fer learnin' what ain't been learnt since the hills was young. Visitors to the homestead grew scarce, yet on the few occasions someone dared to approach, the house exuded an aura of tension, as though its very structure strained under the pressure of something immense and restless inside. Sounds sometimes echoed from the sealed upper-level thuds, too heavy for human footsteps, scraping noises like claws against wood, and low, rhythmic pulses that made the rafters tremble. Once, Mamie Bishop swore she heard what sounded like the stamping of a large animal overhead, though she knew no livestock had been allowed inside the house for years. When confronted, Lavinia would simply turn pale, shaking her head as though terrified to explain, or perhaps forbidden to speak. Her eyes betrayed a vulnerability that had not always been there. Once merely awed, she now carried the look of someone living under constant dread, glancing over her shoulder as though she feared the walls themselves might overhear her. She still muttered her strange prophecies about Wilbur, but the confidence in her voice had been replaced by a nervous quiver, and she grew more fragile with each passing month. Her decline was noted by the townsfolk, and though they pitied her, none offered help. Dunwich had long learned that interfering with the Whateleys often led to consequences no one wanted to face. Yet even from afar, it was clear something in the homestead had changed. Lavinia no longer walked the hills with Wilbur. She no longer appeared at the market, nor did she visit Mamie Bishop for the occasional cup of weak coffee or shared gossip. In fact, she was rarely seen at all. And then, one day, she simply vanished. Her disappearance spread through Dunwich quietly, carried by whispered questions and half-formed suspicions. Old Whateley claimed she had gone off lookin' fer signs in the hills, but his wavering voice convinced no one. Others suggested she had fled the valley in terror, unable to bear the presence of whatever she and her father had brought into the world. But the simpler and far more chilling assumption gained traction. Whatever lived behind the sealed boards upstairs had taken her. The air around the homestead felt heavier after she vanished, thick with an unsettling resonance that seemed almost alive. The cattle deaths increased. Villagers noted that the Whateley barn, which once reeked of rotting timbers and sour hay, now gave off an odor far more sinister, something metallic, bodily, and wrong. And on windless nights, faint echoes of movement still drifted from the upper room, vibrating subtly across the fields. Following Lavinia's disappearance, Wilbur grew even more rapidly, his body stretching unnaturally, his skin taut across muscle and bone. He no longer resembled a child in any recognizable sense. His features sharpened, his expression hardened, and a chilling intelligence radiated from him. He spent long hours in the reclaimed upper level, though how he entered the space, given its sealed appearance, was a question best left unasked. When people passed the homestead, they sometimes glimpsed him through a crack in the remaining curtains, his tall figure bent over ancient books far too large for a boy his age. They would hurry on, feeling watched long after they left. Dogs, which had always despised him, now refused to cross the road near the house altogether. They whined and cowered, their tails tucked between their legs, their eyes fixed on the upper story, as though expecting something monstrous to burst through the boards. More than once, dogs broke their leashes entirely to flee the vicinity, and their owners stopped bringing them near the Whateley property at all. Old Whateley himself seemed to be wasting away, though the intensity of his movements betrayed a strength he should not have possessed in his frail state. His eyes glimmered with fanatic urgency as he instructed Wilbur in the rituals and calculations necessary for their dark purpose. Yet beneath his fervor lay a flicker of fear, a fear not of the villagers, nor of outsiders, but of the very thing he had helped create. He had known, since Wilbur's first cry on Candlemas morning, that something extraordinary had been set in motion, but by now, even he could sense they had passed a point of no return. No matter how tightly he sealed the doors or how many boards he hammered into place, the house itself could not contain the destiny taking form within its walls. The villagers tried to assure themselves that Lavinia had simply left, or perhaps had fallen victim to the rough terrain of the hills. But in their hearts, they knew better. They knew from the trembling of the earth on Halloween nights. They knew from the stains livestock left behind in the Whateley pastures. They knew from the glimpses of Wilbur growing taller by the week, speaking in languages no one recognized, and carrying himself like someone preparing for a journey far beyond the boundaries of Dunwich. Something else lived in that house, something that had been kept hidden since Wilbur's birth, something that had feasted on cattle, learned to move in darkness, and grown faster than anyone imagined. Something that no longer required Lavinia. Whatever remained sealed behind the boards of the upper room had become part of the Whateley legacy, an unspoken truth the family no longer bothered to conceal. Its presence radiated downward through the floors, across the beams, and out into the valley. Dunwich felt it, and soon all the world would, too. As the years crawled forward and Dunwich slipped further into decline, Wilbur Whateley grew with an urgency that seemed almost hostile to nature. It was as though time itself bent around him, accelerating his development as if pushed by some invisible force. By the time he reached the age of 4, the boy bore little resemblance to a child. He stood as tall as a youth of 15, his limbs long and sinewy, his shoulders broadening with unnatural speed. His features, once merely odd, sharpened into something far more alien, a blend of human structure and hints of an ancestry no one dared name aloud. Those who saw him in passing could not shake the feeling that he was a mistake of the natural order, a thing born in defiance of biology. His yellowish skin clung tightly to bone and muscle, pocked with large pores that gave him a perpetual appearance of sweating or seething. His coarse, dark hair curled wildly, resisting combing or trimming. His teeth, when revealed in one of his rare, thin smiles, appeared too strong, too sharp, as though built for tearing rather than chewing. Yet the most disconcerting aspect of Wilbur's appearance was his eyes, dark, deep, and disturbingly knowing. They did not shine with the bright curiosity of childhood, but instead carried an unsettling focus, as though absorbing and measuring every detail around him. As physical changes overtook him, his behavior intensified in ways no one could ignore. The boy who once wandered the hills at Lavinia's side now roamed alone, moving silently through the forests with an eerie confidence. He carried himself like someone accustomed to being watched, and perhaps accustomed to watching the watchers in return. His gait, though human in shape, suggested something else beneath the surface, some latent power urging him forward as though the land itself responded to his presence. He rarely spoke to the townsfolk, but when he did, his voice was deep and resonant, far too mature for someone so young, yet lacking the full articulation of adulthood. His sentences were short, deliberate, and often cryptic, revealing glimpses of knowledge beyond what he should have possessed. More than once, a villager found themselves unsettled by how Wilbur pronounced certain names or ancient terms, as though he had grown up hearing them whispered in the dark. What terrified Dunwich most, however, was the way animals responded to him. Dogs fiercely loyal, stubborn, and brave in these harsh rural landscapes cowered at his approach. They bared their teeth but dared not strike, retreating with a mixture of fear and hatred that bordered on madness. Horses reared violently when Wilbur appeared near their stalls, and cattle grew restless whenever he passed. Animals sensed something people could not articulate, and their instinctual alarm spread unease throughout the valley. In a place where livestock meant survival, such reactions were not simply strange, they were dangerous. Wilbur, for his part, seemed unbothered by their terror. He carried a pistol to fend off particularly aggressive dogs, and though he used it sparingly, the few who witnessed him fire remarked on the cold precision of his aim. The shots reverberated through the fields like grim announcements of his growing deterrence. Even the bravest farmers learned not to let their dogs wander near the Whateley property. Inside the homestead, the changes were even more unnerving. The sealed upper room, once merely a source of dread, now shook occasionally, with movements too heavy to belong to a man or boy. Along with old Whateley's obsessive repairs came the unmistakable sounds of large bodies shifting, scraping, and heaving behind the boarded walls. Wilbur spent long hours inside that upper floor, though no one ever saw him enter through any doorway. Somehow, impossibly, he slipped between the house's spaces as though guided through hidden passages or through means no carpenter had crafted. He continued to study the ancient tomes passed down through the Whateley line, and his ability to parse their cryptic pages grew terrifyingly swift. Languages forgotten for centuries seemed natural on his tongue. The diagrams and sigils etched into the pages did not confuse him. They inspired him. He memorized patterns of stars, recited lines describing unseen geometries, and practiced symbols that made even old Whateley step back in awe or fear. By now, the old man's condition had worsened. He trembled constantly, his skin sagging around his bones, and his muttering had grown sharper, more frantic. Yet his eyes glowed with a feverish pride whenever he looked upon Wilbur, as though watching a prophecy unfold. He spoke often of "preparin' fur the openin'" and repeated warnings that things must be done proper, it ain't no use. He drilled Wilbur in rituals, teaching him chants that set the air thrumming and filled the house with vibrations no human ear should hear. But something else began to appear in Wilbur, something darker, more inward. His speech grew sparse. His interactions with Dunwich dwindled. He no longer made any attempt to hide his disdain for the villagers, nor did he show any attachment to the land except for the forbidding curves of Sentinel Hill. Whenever the rituals blazed on its summit, Wilbur stood closest to the stone altar, chanting with a fervor that rivaled, if not surpassed, old Whateley's. As his body reached the height of a grown man, his face matured into a grotesque fusion of humanity and something untamed. The sharp angles, the heavy brows, the oddly elongated ears, all combined to give him a look both brilliant and hideous. Even those who saw him from afar recognized immediately that he was no longer a child, not even in the loosest sense. There was no innocence in him, no playfulness, no hint of youth. He projected an aura of inevitability, as though he were not merely aging but advancing toward a predetermined form. And then came the whispers that Wilbur no longer slept. From dusk till dawn, lights flickered in the shuttered windows of the homestead. Strange scents drifted down the hills. Chanting noises, at times human, at times not, carried faintly on the wind. The boards of the upper room vibrated more frequently, rattling with impacts too forceful to be caused by man or beast. Dunwich kept its distance, but its fear grew palpable. For every new sighting of Wilbur taller, heavier, more monstrous, came a renewed sense that something terrible had been set in motion years ago, on the night of his birth. The old stories about forbidden shapes rising from the hills felt less like folklore and more like prophecy. Those who had once dismissed tales of ancient beings lurking between the worlds began to reconsider their skepticism. Wilbur Whateley was no longer merely different. He was becoming something else entirely. And whatever he was becoming, it was tied deeply, irrevocably, to the thing kept hidden behind the boards of the upper room, the thing that grew in the shadows, fed on cattle, and stirred restlessly, as if awaiting its moment to step beyond the threshold. Dunwich could sense it, Wilbur could feel it, and the hills, ancient and watchful, seemed to tremble with anticipation. By the time the strange manuscript from the Whateley farmhouse reached the scholars of Miskatonic University, an uneasy atmosphere had already taken hold among those who had glimpsed Wilbur's corpse and recognized, even dimly, that it had been an abomination not wholly grounded in human lineage. Yet nothing prepared them for the baffling, labyrinthine text left behind in the battered ledger found in Wilbur's room. Its pages, filled with symbols resembling a distorted form of Arabic, taunted every academic who attempted to decipher them. Hours were spent poring over the alien characters, but progress was painfully slow and the meaning obstinately obscure. The scholars argued over whether the alphabet was ancient or invented, whether it encoded forgotten rites or secret histories. Some believed it a cipher, others a synthetic language, crafted by a mind both brilliant and deranged. A few dismissed it as the ravings of a lunatic, though those were the same men who had not stood inside the reading room where Wilbur's monstrous remains dissolved into the floor. Those who had witnessed that spectacle did not speak so lightly. They felt instinctively that every mark on that ledger held significance and perhaps danger. Dr. Henry Armitage, shaken yet propelled by an almost feverish sense of responsibility, accepted the task of decoding the manuscript. He alone among the scholars had confronted the full strangeness of Wilbur's death, and he alone understood that the diary could not be dismissed as fantasy. The memory of Wilbur's dark, imploring eyes and the unholy stench that had filled the library still haunted him. Something had been left unfinished in Dunwich, something the boy had been nurturing, cultivating, preparing, and whatever it was, it had not died with him. Night after night, Armitage sat hunched over the pages, comparing symbols, testing theories, drawing upon centuries-old treatises on cryptography. He delved into the writings of Trithemius and Porta, studied ancient codes used by secret sects, and referenced obscure translations of forbidden texts whispered about among occult scholars. He pursued every path, even when they led to the darkest corridors of human superstition, because he sensed that the Whateley manuscript was not merely a document, it was a blueprint, and if he deciphered it, he would uncover Wilbur's intention, and perhaps the intention of forces even older. As Armitage worked, the valley of Dunwich simmered with its own signs of unrest. Rumblings shook the hills with increasing frequency. Dogs barked through the night. Strange lights flickered atop Sentinel Hill. But the most disturbing reports came from the boarded Whateley farmhouse, where neighbors whispered of thunderous footsteps, scraping noises, and the sounds of immense bodies shifting in the dark. Something within the house was alive, something growing, something waiting. On the night of September 2nd, Armitage finally felt the veil lift. With sudden clarity, the cipher resolved itself, revealing English phrases hidden beneath the alien script. His pulse quickened as he read, realizing immediately that the text was indeed a diary written by a being whose mind, despite its youth, rivaled the intellect of the most ancient scholars and the most blasphemous cults. Yet, the content was far worse than the method. What he deciphered was nothing short of a declaration of intent. Wilbur's purpose, his training, his devotion to Yog-Sothoth, and the chilling acknowledgement that he was preparing the earth for something vast, something cosmic, something that would wipe clean all forms of life. Armitage trembled as he translated line after line, his horror deepening with each revelation. Wilbur had been taught since infancy to open gates between dimensions, to summon beings beyond comprehension, to thin the barrier between the human world and the old ones. He wrote of rituals performed on Sentinel Hill, of visions granted through incomprehensible mathematics, of voices whispering from the air and shapes moving behind the veil of reality. The boy had not merely studied forbidden knowledge, he had lived within its currents. He had practiced rites, meant to rend the world open. Worse, the diary revealed that something had been growing upstairs in the sealed room, something that required constant feeding, something that was not fully formed when Wilbur last tended it, a creature born alongside him, yet of far more monstrous heritage, a twin, a manifestation of forces that existed outside human perception. It was clear that Wilbur intended not only to summon his father, Yog-Sothoth, but to use his brother as the instrument of the world's eradication. As Armitage reached the diary's middle entries, he grew faint with dread. He read Wilbur's musings about the limitations of the human body, the need for transformation, and the tantalizing promise of becoming transfigured when the earth was cleared. He read of Wilbur seeing glimpses of cities at the magnetic poles, cities not made of stone or flesh but of angles that cut through space. He read of rituals designed to burn reality open, allowing the old ones to reclaim domains they had once ruled. The more Armitage read, the clearer it became that Wilbur's death had not ended the threat. It had merely delayed it. The being upstairs, the one fed with livestock, the one whose heavy steps shook the boards, the one Wilbur had nurtured since birth, was still alive, still growing, still waiting for the proper words, the proper alignment of forces, the proper moment to break free. By the time Armitage finished the final decipherable lines, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He sealed his translations into an envelope, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The words on the pages seemed to hum with power, as though repeating themselves in a whispering chorus around him. He felt a crushing weight settle upon him, a weight of responsibility, of fear, of grim clarity. He alone understood what was coming. He alone had read the truth behind Wilbur Whateley's monstrous brilliance. He returned home that night with the look of a man who had glimpsed the edge of the abyss and realized the abyss was now looking back. His wife begged him to rest, but he could not. He paced, muttered, and occasionally stopped to stare at the horizon, as though expecting a shape to rise there. In fevered moments, he cried out warnings about the Whateley farmhouse, about a creature that must be destroyed before it completed its transformation. He raved about gates, about dimensions, about ancient beings waiting to reclaim the universe. Yet beneath the delirium lay a core of terrible truth. For Armitage now knew that the world had brushed against extinction once already, and that the surviving creature Wilbur left behind was poised to continue the task. And in the hills of Dunwich, as if answering his dread, the ground trembled again. When September deepened into its darker weeks, Dunwich felt as though it were holding its breath. Dogs barked ceaselessly through the nights, odd lights shimmered on the peaks, and the ground beneath the domed hills trembled with a slow, ominous pulse, as if something vast were stirring beneath the soil. After the death of Wilbur Whateley, many hoped that the evil he had nurtured would dissipate with him. But those hopes dissolved quickly, for the hills now groaned with a new intensity, vibrating through the valley like the heartbeat of something waking from a long, ravenous sleep. The boarded Whateley farmhouse, already feared by all, had begun to emit sounds that no one dared investigate, thunderous shifting, dragging noises, and guttural reverberations that shook the ground even at a distance. Earl Sawyer, who tended the cattle during Wilbur's absence, confessed tremblingly that he heard something enormous pacing behind the sealed boards, something too heavy, too coordinated to be any natural creature. He often found himself staring at the house from afar, imagining it swelling outward, as though its walls strained to contain a monstrous form. Each night, the stench drifting from it worsened, an acrid, nauseating odor that seemed to burn the air. Then came the morning when Luther Brown, the hired boy from the Corey farm, returned from his daily task of gathering the cows and burst into the kitchen, gasping and near fainting. He spoke of gigantic tracks in the soft road circular impressions as large as barrels, but too deep, too sprawling, to be made by any known animal. The prints were surrounded by radiating grooves, like the marks left by some titanic palms pressing into the earth. Bushes and saplings along the roadside had been flattened in a perfect broad swath, as if something the size of a house had forced its way through them. He was certain he had smelled the same stench that drifted from the Whateley property. It clung to the air like invisible rot, piercing through the morning chill. Soon, more reports came. Sally Sawyer called her neighbors in terror, telling them that her boy Chauncey had run home white as chalk after investigating the Whateley ruins. The house had been blown apart, split open, as if something powerful had burst from within. Only the ground floor remained partially standing, and even that was covered with a foul, tar-like residue that dripped from the shattered timbers. The yard was scarred with the same enormous prints Luther had seen, and trails of matted grass led toward the fields, like the pathway of a sliding mountain. Cattle were missing. Those that remained were mutilated, drained, fragile like empty skins. They bore the same strange wounds that had plagued the Whateley herd for years, but now magnified in scale and savagery. Dunwich knew then the truth that no one dared admit aloud. Wilbur's twin, the unseen horror raised in the sealed upper room, had broken free. By mid-morning, nearly every able-bodied man in Dunwich had gathered at the ruins, though none dared move close. The swaths of crushed vegetation were indisputable. Even the most hardened farmers trembled at the enormity of the tracks, at the bent and splintered trees on steep slopes where no human or earthly animal could climb. Something huge had emerged from that place, something that could walk, unseen, through the ravines. The villagers followed the tracks only as far as the edge of Cold Spring Glen, where the trail plunged downward into a gorge so deep and shadowed that even the bravest men hesitated to approach. The dogs that accompanied them snarled and whimpered, refusing to descend. A terrible smell wafted upward from the depths, a smell that made the gorge seem less like part of the natural world and more like the entrance to something ancient, hidden, and hungry. Though the people barricaded their homes that night, the horror did not remain confined to the glen. It came again. At Elmer Fry's farmhouse, the family awoke to the sound of wood splintering. The barn groaned and cracked as though crushed by invisible weight. There were screams, animal and human, that carried across the valley. By dawn, the Fry farm was in ruins, with only a reeking smear of tar-like substance where the barn had once stood. The family was gone, vanished without a trace. Panic spread through Dunwich like wildfire. No one understood how to defend against a creature no one could see. Guns felt useless. Pitchforks, knives, barricades, none of it mattered when the enemy could not be perceived. The monstrous presence seemed to move by a logic alien to man, a drifting catastrophe whose direction could only be guessed by the trembling of the earth and the snapping of trees. While terror mounted in Dunwich, Dr. Armitage at Miskatonic University was completing his translation of the diary. His face grew more drawn each day, and the tremor in his hands worsened. But he refused to stop. He believed, he knew, that whatever stalked the valley was tied directly to Wilbur's writings. And indeed, the diary hinted at a creature that grows by the day, a being meant to tear the world open when the time came. Armitage finally read the awful truth. The thing Wilbur had raised was not merely a monster. It was a key, a bridge, a necessary piece in a cosmic mechanism built to summon forces far beyond the human world. When the first Associated Press report written mockingly referred to the Dunwich monster as a product of bootleg whiskey, Armitage felt a cold dread settle over him. The world outside Dunwich had no idea what was coming. Something had to be done, and fast. He summoned Professor Rice and Dr. Morgan, and together they pored over Wilbur's notes, ancient grimoires, and rituals spoken of only in frightened whispers. They argued, debated, searched for patterns in the madness. Finally, Armitage found something, a spell, an incantation that could dissolve the creature, forcing it back into the nothingness from which its father originated. But performing it would require approaching the entity directly, facing a being that was invisible, colossal, and enraged. There was no other option. They had to go to Dunwich. On Friday morning, Under a sky that seemed dimmer than usual, the three men set out by automobile, carrying with them the book, the sprayer that would reveal the creature's outline, and a desperate plan. They arrived in Dunwich shortly after midday. The valley was unnaturally still, and the people wore expressions of bewildered terror. The Fry House was a wasteland. The Bishop farmhouse was splintered and empty. The woods trembled with the distant echoes of something vast moving through them. More troubling still, the trail of destruction led toward Sentinel Hill. Armitage knew instantly what it meant. The creature was ascending the hill, the ritual site. It was going to finish what Wilbur had started. No time remained. The horror had begun its march across the world, and only 3 men stood between humanity and an ancient cosmic hunger awakened once more. The closer Dr. Armitage, Professor Rice, and Dr. Morgan came to Sentinel Hill, the more they sensed the oppressive weight that hung over Dunwich. The air itself felt strained, as though stretched thin by the presence of something immense and unseen, something that bent the fabric of the world merely by existing. The terrified villagers who flocked around the 3 scholars spoke in panicked tones, pointing toward the hill where trees bent backward as though brushed aside by a titanic, wandering hand. Though the creature remained invisible, the evidence of its passage was everywhere. Snapped branches, crushed underbrush, and deep impressions gouged into the muddy earth by limbs too massive to imagine. The men knew they were running out of time. The monster had already destroyed the Fry and Bishop households with an efficiency that made its invisibility seem even more terrifying. Now, driven by a purpose that only Wilbur Whateley's diary hinted at, it had begun making its way toward the very place where generations of dark rituals had weakened the barrier between worlds. Sentinel Hill, the altar stone, the place of calling. Armitage felt dread clinging to him like a shadow, yet urgency pushed him forward. His memory churned with Wilbur's cryptic diary entries pages, describing how the twin born of outsideness would ascend the hill when the time was right, calling for the father, whose name had echoed through the valley for years, Yog Sothoth. The thought of the name made his blood run cold. The creature was not simply wandering, it was returning to the place of its birthright, compelled by something older than the hills themselves. The villagers gathered near the base of the hill, transfixed by a sight only partially visible to the eye, the movement of bushes as they bowed outward, forming a broad, trembling swath that snaked upward toward the summit. No sound of footsteps accompanied the motion, only an eerie vibration in the ground, as though something enormous moved just below the surface of reality. The whippoorwills, perched along the ravine, shrieked in unnatural rhythm, as if anticipating some cosmic event. With trembling hands, Armitage retrieved the pocket telescope from his coat and scanned the slopes. Rice and Morgan stood close, their expressions grim, awaiting the report. The villagers behind them held their breath, afraid to look yet unable to look away. At first, Armitage saw nothing but sunlight playing across the grass and stone. Then, suddenly, he saw the brush ripple. A line of distortion-like heat shimmering on a summer road glided against the hillside. The pattern of bent foliage was undeniable. Something vast was climbing, pulling itself forward with its giant, unseen limbs. Armitage's stomach tightened. The creature was heading directly for the ancient altar stone. He lowered the telescope, his face pale. "It's climbing. We must reach higher ground if we hope to confront it." Morgan clutched the heavy rifle more symbol than weapon. "If we're going up there, we're facing it alone. These people can't help us." Armitage nodded. "Better they stay here. What we must do cannot be witnessed by anyone unprepared." Rice checked the metal sprayer strapped to his side, the device containing the powder that, if Armitage's studies were correct, could reveal the invisible monstrosity for a brief window of time. That window would be their only chance to recite the banishment. The dreadful incantation drawn from Wilbur's notes and cross-referenced with arcane texts from Miskatonic's restricted archives. The words themselves seemed to coil through Armitage's mind, a chant meant not for human tongues but for echoing across the trembling barrier between worlds. Without waiting for further discussion, the three men began their ascent. The climb was steep and littered with newly broken branches, each snapped with a force too deliberate to be natural. The hillside terrain shook beneath them intermittently, as if the creature were repositioning itself just ahead. Sometimes they felt its presence like a gust of wind, other times like the faint ripple of heat against their cheeks, always near, always shifting. Further down the slope, the villagers watched with growing anxiety. Curtis Whateley held the telescope now, his hands shaking violently. As he peered through the lens, his face contorted into terror. He saw the men drawing closer to a point where the beast's path crossed theirs, and though he could not see the thing itself, he saw the earth heave under its invisible weight, the bushes quivering as they were pushed aside. Suddenly, Armitage signaled for Rice to prepare the sprayer. They had reached the vantage point they needed, a small ridge overlooking a curve in the monster's path. From here, they could ambush it, forcing it into visibility for the moment required. The men steadied themselves. Armitage recited the opening syllables of the rite under his breath, his voice trembling but determined. Then it happened. Rice squeezed the trigger on the sprayer, releasing a cloud of fine dust into the air. It drifted downward in a shimmering haze, settling onto something that was not supposed to exist, something that twisted the light around it as it moved. For a single, horrifying instant, the outline of the beast took form. Villagers screamed from below. Curtis dropped the telescope and nearly collapsed. The creature was larger than they had imagined, larger than the Whateley farmhouse, a mass of writhing appendages, bulging shapes, and shifting geometries that defied earthly description. Its limbs resembled giant, arthritic trunks. Its surface roiled like living rope. And atop it all, emerging from the center of its shapeless mass, was something unspeakably worse. A half-formed face, a human face, a face that bore unmistakable traces of the Whateley line, stretched to monstrous dimension. Rice gasped. Morgan swore under his breath. Armitage steadied himself, forcing his gaze away from the grotesque details and into the purpose of their mission. "Begin," he ordered. His voice rose above the wind, above the shrieking whippoorwills, above the low rumbling of the monster as it reacted to suddenly being seen. The chant poured from his lips in a language older than recorded history, a string of syllables that seemed to twist the air as he spoke them. Rice and Morgan joined him, their voices trembling but resolute. Below, villagers covered their ears. Some prayed, others fled, but most stood transfixed, watching three men confront the impossible. As the chant intensified, the skies dimmed unnaturally. Shadows stretched in directions they should not. A purple hue seeped across the horizon, as though the fabric of reality itself were thinning. Lightning cracked soundlessly above the altar stone. The creature reared, its unseen body thrashing violently. The hillside shook as though an earthquake had struck, but the three men held their ground, voices rising in unison until the incantation reached its crescendo. A final chant, sharp, resonant, commanding, tore through the air. For a single, world-shaking moment, the beast hesitated. Its limbs quivered, its grotesque face twisted in something like recognition, perhaps even fear. Then a blinding flash erupted from the heavens, striking the altar stone with a force that seemed to rip open the sky itself. And the impossible thing began to unravel. The air atop Sentinel Hill shook with a violence that seemed almost cosmic in scale. As the crack of lightning struck the ancient altar stone, the shockwave rippled outward, bending the grass, twisting the trees, and staggering every man below who dared to watch. The colossal, half-visible creature reeled backward, its massive form wavering like a heat mirage caught in a gale. For the first time since it had escaped the Whateley farmhouse, the unseen titan hesitated, recoiling as if struck by a force it recognized but feared. Armitage, Rice, and Morgan held their position, though their bodies trembled under the oppressive weight of the horror before them. The powder's effect began to fade, and the vast monstrosity flickered between semi-visibility and total absence, as though reality itself struggled to decide whether it should exist. Even so, the blurred contours of the beast remained perceptible. The writhing ropes, the pulsating limbs, the clusters of bulging eyes opening and closing across its amorphous hide. Above it all loomed the ghastly face, half-human, stretched to obscene proportions, with hair like distorted albino tendrils waving madly in the wind. Down below, the villagers huddled in terrified clusters. Some clung to prayer, others shielded their eyes. A few sobbed openly, convinced that the end of the world had arrived. The whippoorwills screamed in frenzied patterns, as if competing with the storm itself. The wind grew colder, sharper, carrying hints of impossible scents, ozone, stone dust, and something ancient, metallic, and wrong. The creature's voice rose. It began as a low rumble, a deep-bellied groan that rattled the bones of every living thing within miles. Then the sound thickened, forming guttural phrases not shaped by any earthly throat. Words emerged like seismic shocks, harsh, grinding syllables that scraped across consciousness and pierced the mind more than the ear. The villagers clamped their hands over their ears, yet the sound burrowed inward regardless, vibrating in their skulls. Ignai, Ignai, Talius, Yog-Sothoth. The monstrous croaking rolled down the hill like a thunderous chant of doom. It was not merely a cry, it was a calling, a summoning, a plea to the cosmic father whose presence lingered just beyond the veil. Armitage felt the name strike him like a blow. Yog-Sothoth, the same name Wilbur had shrieked in his final moments, the same name that haunted the diary's pages, the same name that Dunwich whispered but never understood. Now it reverberated across Sentinel Hill with terrifying clarity, carried on the breath of a creature built to breach worlds. The ground trembled harder. Armitage forced himself upright, lifting his hands again as his voice cracked into the wind. "Stay with me," continue the chant. Rice and Morgan rallied beside him. Exhausted, shaken, but bound by duty, they resumed their recitation. The words they spoke were older than human civilization, borrowed from the darkest corners of myth. They pulled the syllables from forbidden tomes and scattered pages of ritual lore, combining them in a desperate attempt to twist back the cosmic door. Wilbur and his family had pried open. As their voices rose, the unnatural gloom thickening the sky deepened. Light drained from the world, and the blue of day collapsed into a purplish void. A wind howled up the slope, whipping coats and caps, tearing at the sprayer hanging at Rice's side. Sparks of electricity danced among the stones. Even the birds fell silent, every living creature waiting for the next movement in this cataclysmic symphony. Then the creature cried again, but this time the sound warped suddenly, as if something within it was fracturing. Ignai, Ya, Help. Help. Father, Father, Yog-Sothoth. The echo of those desperate human-like cries stopped the villagers' hearts. Even Armitage felt his chant falter for a moment, frozen by shock. The creature's voice, vast, distorted, alien, had slipped into English. It pleaded, it screamed with a tone unmistakably terrified, unmistakably childlike. For a brief instant, the invisible titan seemed less like a monster and more like a lost being, reaching for the only parent it had ever known. Then the air broke apart. A deafening explosion of sound cracked across the sky, louder than thunder, louder than any earthly blast. Even the hills shuddered under the blow. A wave of unseen energy surged downward, slamming into the valley with an almost physical force. Men were thrown backward, grass flattened, trees bent with a tortured groan. The whippoorwills plunged silent all at once, falling from the air like broken leaves. And in the center of the blast, directly atop the altar stone, the impossible creature began to come apart. Armitage, blinking through the blinding light, saw its colossal, flickering form twist violently. The powder's residue lit up once more, revealing the creature's true shape in vivid, horrifying detail. Its limbs contorted, its ropes of flesh writhed uncontrollably, the half-human face shriveled, its monstrous eyes rolling upward as if in agony or surrender. The thing seemed to be not dying, but unraveling, pulled apart by forces from within and without. He shouted the final line of the banishment. Rice and Morgan echoed it, and suddenly the chant resonated like a bell across all directions, vibrating through the stones beneath their feet. The creature convulsed. A great tremor tore through its mass. Then it dissolved. Not burst, not collapsed, dissolved. The colossal body split into threads of light and dust, peeling away as though unspooled from the fabric of existence. Each piece evaporated into the air, vanishing into the same unseen dimensional gulf that had birthed it. By the time the shockwave faded, nothing remained atop Sentinel Hill but the faint residue of tar and a lingering smell of cosmic decay. Armitage slumped forward, catching himself with a shaking hand. Rice collapsed to his knees. Morgan leaned heavily on the sprayer, gasping like a drowning man breaking through the surface. Below, the villagers slowly rose from the ground, dazed. Curtis Whateley blinked through tears, whispering hoarsely, "It's gone. It's really gone." Armitage wiped sweat and dust from his brow, steadying his breath. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but resolute. "The thing has returned to its origin. It was never meant to exist in this world. What little of it was flesh has been dissolved, and the greater part, the part from beyond, has gone back to him." He looked out toward the valley, where the hills had finally fallen silent. The sunlight began returning to the land, hesitant, but growing brighter. "It can never exist again," he said softly. Then, after a heavy pause, he spoke the truth that chilled everyone who heard it. It was Wilbur's twin, and it looked more like the father. The wind that swept across Sentinel Hill carried with it the fading scent of something unearthly, an odor of decay mingled with a metallic tang that did not belong to any natural element of the valley. As the purple stain in the sky dissolved into returning daylight, the silence that followed felt immense, as if the entire landscape had exhaled after holding its breath for years. The monstrous presence, the invisible titan that had crawled from the Whateley farmhouse and moved through Dunwich like a living catastrophe, had finally been unmade, but the terror it unleashed lingered in the memories of those who had witnessed its passing. Armitage, Rice, and Morgan descended from the ridge slowly, their legs trembling not only from exhaustion but from the indescribable weight of what they had confronted. Their faces were pale, hollowed by the confrontation with forces no human mind was meant to endure. The villagers, gathering cautiously in the faint sunlight, watched them with a mixture of awe and fear. They had seen the three men chanting at the peak, their voices rising against whirlwinds and invisible horrors. They had watched a flash from the heavens strike the altar stone, and then the unmaking of the thing that had prowled their valley. To them, these men seemed not scholars, but wielders of strange power figures in whom ancient forces had briefly taken residence. As the three approached, Curtis Whateley, still trembling from his earlier collapse, pushed himself upright. His voice was hoarse, but he found enough breath to utter what was on every mind. What was it really? Armitage halted, his gaze shifting toward the ruined horizon. He weighed his words carefully, knowing that the truth would bring no comfort, but understanding that the people of Dunwich deserved an answer after all they had endured. "It was not a being of this world," he said at last. "Not entirely. Only the faintest fraction of it counted as matter in any form we understand. The rest belonged to something outside our universe, outside our laws of nature. It existed here only through a breach created by black rites practiced by the Whateleys." Some villagers crossed themselves. Others looked toward the ground, as if afraid that speaking of such things aloud would call them back. Rice added quietly, "What we saw was only a momentary glimpse. Its true form was never meant for our eyes." Morgan shuddered at the memory, and thanked God for that. Curtis swallowed, still visibly shaken. "But," It had a face, a man's face, a Whateley face. A ripple of fear swept through the onlookers as they recalled the monstrous half-human visage glimpsed during the powder's fleeting effect. The resemblance to Wilbur and old Whateley had been undeniable. Armitage spoke softly, but with certainty. It was Wilbur's twin, born with him, but hidden away. But unlike Wilbur, it inherited more of the father, more of the outsideness. It grew too rapidly, too monstrously, and when Wilbur died, it began acting on the purpose it had been raised for. And what purpose was that? Someone whispered. Armitage hesitated, not from doubt but from the burden of the truth. He looked at the sky, where a faint echo of the earlier darkness still clung to the horizon. To open the way, he said. To let the old ones through. To pull our world into theirs, or vice versa. The Whateleys had prepared it for years. Only Wilbur's premature death prevented their full design. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The idea that a single family, hidden in the hills, had nearly brought about the end of all existence was too much to comprehend. Armitage continued. Wilbur's diary made it clear. This creature was part of a ritual designed not to harm Dunwich alone, but to wipe the earth clean of life. It was a tool, one forged by cosmic forces for purposes we cannot allow ourselves to fully imagine. The villagers exchanged horrified looks. Their valley, already shunned by outsiders, had come perilously close to becoming the epicenter of an apocalypse. As the men spoke, the breeze shifted across the hillside, carrying faint sounds from the forest below. Birds were beginning to chirp again cautiously, as though unsure whether the world was truly safe. Even the whippoorwills remained silent for the first time in days, scattered or dead from the explosive energy released when the creature had been banished. Their absence brought an eerie calm. One of the older villagers, Zebulon Whateley, leaned upon his cane and stared up at the summit, his eyes clouded by both age and memory. Old Whateley once said we'd hear a child o' Lavinies callin' its father's name atop the hill. His voice cracked. Seems he spoke the truth. Another man stepped forward. But why? Why would they summon something like that? What could they have wanted? Armitage faced him squarely. Power, knowledge. Some seekers of forbidden truths believe the old ones can grant enlightenment or dominion beyond human comprehension. Those beings are not gods of mercy or wisdom. They are forces of chaos. They do not understand humanity, nor do they care for it. To them, we are nothing. The crowd fell silent once more. One young woman voiced the fear that had begun to grip many hearts. Is it really gone? Are you sure it can't come back? Armitage nodded slowly. What remained of it in our world has been dispersed. Its essence has returned to the dimension it originated from. It cannot reform here, not without another breach, and not while we destroy the means of summoning. His eyes shifted to the ancient altar stone, now cracked and scorched by the lightning. That stone must be shattered. Every circle of standing stones on these hills must be torn down. If the old gateways are destroyed, the rituals lose their foundation. The villagers murmured in agreement. Now that they had seen the consequences, they were eager to erase every last remnant of Whateley-like sorcery from their land. Morgan exhaled heavily, rubbing his eyes. I'd help with the dynamite myself if I had the strength. Rice spoke softly. We all need rest. But Armitage shook his head. Rest can wait. Work first. We cannot risk another generation stumbling upon these stones and awakening something best left unnamed. The men descended fully into the valley, followed by the survivors of Dunwich, each bearing the psychological scars of what they had witnessed. The hills seemed quieter, subdued. The earth no longer trembled. And yet, the shadow of what had occurred lingered etched into memory and whispered through families for generations to come. As they walked away from Sentinel Hill, its cracked altar behind them, Armitage glanced once more at the scorched stone and the silent sky above. We came close, he murmured, too softly for the others to hear, far closer than anyone should ever come. And though the horror had been banished, The realization settled heavily within him. There are gateways everywhere in the universe. Some remain sealed, some crack open by accident, and some are forced open by those foolish or desperate enough to seek what lies beyond. In the days that followed the unmaking of the monstrous entity atop Sentinel Hill, Dunwich found itself caught between relief and lingering dread. Though the immediate danger had passed, a heavy, complex silence settled across the valley, a silence thick with fear, confusion, and the fragile hope that the horrors of recent days would never return. Yet beneath the surface of that hope lay an undeniable truth. Nothing in Dunwich would ever be the same again. People spoke in hushed tones, avoiding the more gruesome details of what they had witnessed. Many refused to revisit the sites of destruction, averting their eyes whenever they passed the crushed remnants of the Fry and Bishop homesteads. Even the simplest routines, feeding livestock, walking the fields, drawing water from the well, felt tinged with anxiety. The valley had seen something beyond human comprehension, a force that bent natural law and tore apart the boundary between existence and oblivion. Such things do not fade easily from the mind. Meanwhile, Dr. Armitage returned to Arkham carrying a burden of knowledge that weighed more heavily than any physical load. His colleagues, Rice and Morgan, shared the same haunted expressions, but it was Armitage who bore the greatest strain. He knew more intimately than anyone how close the old ones had come to entering the world. Wilbur's diary had provided terrible clarity, and its revelations echoed endlessly in his thoughts. It was not simply the presence of the creature that had terrified him. It was the purpose behind it. The Whateleys had not acted out of madness, but out of a deliberate, calculated intent, guided by forces that had whispered to them from beyond the dimensions for generations. Back at Miskatonic, Armitage locked himself away in his study, refusing visitors and barely eating. He pored over the scrap of notes he had taken before sealing the rest away forever. He revisited the Necronomicon, though only the passages necessary to confirm his growing suspicion, and cross-referenced Wilbur's writings with other forbidden texts stored in the restricted archives. What he discovered chilled him even more deeply. The rituals the Whateleys had performed were not isolated acts of deviant sorcery. They were pieces of a larger cosmic mechanism, a mechanism known to a handful of ancient cults scattered across the globe, all seeking to open the same metaphysical gates. Armitage realized with dreadful certainty that Dunwich had been only one potential fracture point in the vast, invisible lattice of reality. Others existed, some already weakened, some watched by secret orders, and some entirely unknown. He understood he could reveal none of this to any ordinary person. The truth would unravel their sanity. Even among scholars, only a select few could be trusted with fragments of the knowledge. To speak too openly risked inspiring others to search, to experiment, to summon. Human curiosity was too dangerous when paired with cosmic truth. So he carried the burden quietly, writing a private memorandum before burning every page of it in the library furnace. He told himself it was for the good of the world, that ignorance was the only shield against forces whose names should never be spoken. And though he remained outwardly calm, those close to him noticed how his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking, how his eyes drifted toward the shadows in the corners of rooms. Meanwhile, Dunwich struggled to rebuild. The villagers worked tirelessly to dismantle the stone circles atop the surrounding hills, following Armitage's recommendation with grim determination. They used sledgehammers and dynamite, breaking apart the ancient pillars that had once crowned the domed peaks. Each fall of a column seemed to release a faint sigh of relief from the valley, as if the land itself approved the effort to erase its darkest symbols. Yet even as the structures fell, a question gnawed at many minds. Why had the stones been there in the first place? The simple explanation, that they were relics of indigenous rituals, no longer held weight. Too much had happened. Too many unnatural forces had converged upon them for centuries to accept such a mundane assumption. Whispers spread of ancient tribes fleeing the valley, of early settlers fearing the hills, of unexplained disappearances woven through Dunwich's history. Now, finally, the villagers understood there had been a reason for the fear. A few families packed their belongings and left the valley entirely, unable to endure the memories etched into the landscape. Others stayed but refused to go anywhere near Sentinel Hill, even in daylight. Children were forbidden from wandering alone, and some households kept lanterns burning through the night as a ward against lingering shadows. And then there was Curtis Whateley, haunted by what he had glimpsed through the telescope, the writhing ropes, the monstrous face bearing traces of his own family's features. He found himself unable to sleep. The image carved itself into his dreams. He often woke in the middle of the night, shaking, convinced he heard faint echoes of the beast's desperate plea for its father. At times he wandered out to his porch and stared toward the hills, as though expecting something else to emerge from the darkness. It was some weeks before he regained a semblance of normalcy, but even then, his voice would falter whenever anyone mentioned the name Whateley. He had lived all his life among the decayed branches of his ancestral line, but now he understood how deeply its roots intertwined with things no human lineage should ever touch. The valley's spiritual elders, those who followed the old superstitions, claimed they felt a weight lift from Dunwich after the destruction of the creature, but they warned that such weight never disappears entirely. They spoke of echoes, residual vibrations in the hills where the creature had passed, faint whispers riding the wind on particularly cold nights, and strange stillness that settled over the high meadows at twilight. Armitage, for his part, sensed these echoes too, though from afar. He felt them in the tremors of his dreams, in the slight anomalies in atmospheric pressure that made his skin prickle during thunderstorms, in the eerie coincidence of certain celestial alignments he saw recorded in astronomical charts. Perhaps it was only his heightened awareness, sharpened by trauma, or perhaps, he feared, the boundaries between worlds had been thinned more deeply than he wished to admit. Still, he took comfort in one thing: the gate had been closed, sent back, broken. But he also knew the truth that few living souls could bear. Gates, once opened, even briefly, never seal completely. They leave behind cracks, they leave behind possibilities, and they leave behind the memory of a world that brushed against something vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent. And so, while Dunwich slowly returned to its quiet rhythms, and Miskatonic resumed its scholarly pace, Armitage kept watch in his own way. He monitored manuscripts, corresponded secretly with experts in occult linguistics, and kept the remnants of Wilbur's translated diary locked in a steel box. He vowed never to speak the full truth aloud again, but he vowed also to be ready, should any sign appear that the old ones stirred, or that another misguided soul sought to call them forth. For the world had survived Dunwich, but survival was not the same as safety. As autumn crept over the Miskatonic Valley, Dunwich settled into a strange period of hollow quiet. The violence, the disappearances, the monstrous tracks, every horrific fragment of the recent catastrophe remained etched in memory, but the land itself had grown too subdued, as though recovering from a fever. The hills no longer trembled. The whippoorwills perched silently in the trees, subdued by some lingering force that even they feared. The atmosphere was steady, but it carried an ache, like a wound scabbed over but still tender to the touch. Armitage, back in Arkham, allowed himself a single moment of rest before the weight of everything he had learned returned to him in full. He found no glory in what he, Rice, and Morgan had done on Sentinel Hill. If anything, he felt only a deeper dread because he now understood how fragile the world truly was. Humanity existed atop a thin crust of illusion, unaware that beneath the surface lay abyssal forces vast enough to swallow existence itself. It was not victory he felt. It was a reprieve. In Dunwich, the sheriff's office and state authorities attempted to process what had happened using the rational vocabulary of law and natural disaster. They arrived in small investigative teams, scribbling notes, measuring footprints, inspecting the shattered remnants of the Fry and Bishop homes, but none of their rational tools could explain what they found. The sheriff spoke reluctantly of structural collapse, of possible explosive accidents, but his voice wavered. The tracks, those enormous, circular impressions embedded deep into the soil, could not be catalogued as any species of animal, machine, or geological anomaly. The tar-like residue found on stones and tree trunks puzzled every lab. After days of fruitless investigation, the reports were quietly sealed. Too strange, too implausible, too disruptive to publish. Dunwich was deemed a place best left unexamined, as it always had been. Outsiders departed as swiftly as they came, abandoning their questions in the dust of the valley road. And the villagers, who had seen far more than the outsiders ever could, understood intimately why the silence was necessary. Yet despite the desire to move on, the valley bore permanent marks of the horror. Sentinel Hill still carried the scorch where the cosmic bolt had struck. The grass surrounding the altar stone had not grown back properly. It remained ashy, gray, brittle, and stiff, even after the first frosts. Children avoided the hill entirely, and their parents never discouraged this fear. The land itself seemed marked contaminated by the presence of something not of this world. Some older residents recalled whispers of similar disturbances generations before. Inexplicable sounds, sudden disappearances, strange lights flickering on moonless nights. The valley's tragedies, they suggested, formed a pattern far older than the Whateleys. But no one dared trace those patterns aloud. Dunwich had always been a place of uneasy superstition, but now those superstitions felt less like folklore and more like survival instincts. The people did not discuss the Whateleys anymore, not in daylight, and certainly not beneath the shadow of the hills. Meanwhile, Armitage's colleagues at Miskatonic struggled to return to normal scholarly pursuits. Rice and Morgan resumed teaching, but students noted a changed look in their eyes, a distant vigilance, a sensitivity to shadows and sudden sounds. Morgan sometimes paused mid-lecture, as though catching echoes of a chant only he could hear. Rice grew reclusive, shelving his research on folklore entirely, unable to continue now that he had seen the terrible truths hiding beneath those tales. Armitage, older and more burdened than both, spent long hours in the restricted archives, reviewing past correspondences, letters between antiquarians, occult researchers, and forgotten scholars who had hinted at dimensional breaches throughout history. Cryptic references to gates, thin places, and the guardians of the threshold appeared repeatedly. He now recognized how much of the world's secret history had been dismissed as madness simply because it was too terrifying to accept. At times, he found himself wondering what might have happened had the three of them arrived too late. If the creature had reached the summit before they had cast the banishment. If Wilbur's twin had succeeded in completing the ritual, he imagined the air splitting apart like a wound, the stars reconfiguring themselves, and whole cities shrinking into nothingness as cosmic beings poured through a widening rift. A world consumed not by fire or flood, but by dimensional collapse. Humanity erased, not with malice, but with indifference. One afternoon in Arkham, Armitage paused during his reading, struck by a sudden chill that shook him from his concentration. He realized he had been staring at a marginal note in one of the older diaries, a scribbled line from a 17th-century occultist that read, "They wait at the angles, where the light cannot follow." The meaning struck him differently now. Angles, not arches, not doorways, but angles geometries, where the boundaries of reality became pliable. And he suddenly understood that the Whateley rituals had exploited these very angles within Sentinel Hill's topography. The hills of Dunwich were not merely geological formations. They were natural fulcrums of arcane geometry, weak points where the walls of existence grew thin. With this realization came another. Such places existed elsewhere. Armitage folded the diary slowly, pressing his trembling fingers against the cover. The implications haunted him. Even if they destroyed every stone circle in Dunwich, Similar rituals might be possible in other remote regions of the world where ancient topographies aligned with cosmic forces. The Whateleys had not created such knowledge. They had inherited it, piecemeal, from older, deeper sources. He spent late nights writing letters to trusted occult scholars across Europe and South America, urging caution and vigilance. He avoided specifics, but hinted at significant danger. A few wrote back with concern, others with confusion. None could fathom the dread behind Armitage's polite phrasing, and he hoped they never would. Meanwhile, Dunwich slowly began to breathe again, though it would never breathe normally. Farmers returned to their work with cautious steps. Children resumed playing in the meadows, though they avoided the ravines where the creature had passed, sensing instinctively the dark memory imprinted in the earth. The animals, too, regained their old patterns, though dogs still refused to go near the Whateley ruins and sometimes howled at nothing visible in the night. No rebuilding occurred on the Whateley land. No one claimed it. The farmhouse stood as a hollow carcass of rotting boards and splintered beams, left untouched because no one dared venture close. Over time, brambles, weeds, and creeping vines crawled across it, as if nature itself wished to smother the site and conceal its scars. Still, the villagers occasionally felt something on the wind when they passed the old farm, a faint, cold vibration, as though the memory of whatever had grown inside the boarded room still lingered, trapped between worlds. Armitage sensed it too, even miles away in Arkham. He felt it in the way his dreams twisted, in the way books seemed to whisper when he turned their pages late at night. He knew the creature had been destroyed, yes, but destruction did not erase the echo of its existence. Forces capable of creating such a being did not vanish with a lightning strike. They remained dormant, waiting, and he feared the day when someone else, somewhere else, might stumble upon the same forbidden knowledge, driven by curiosity or desperation to reopen the gates that had nearly ended the world. The danger had passed, but the shadow of danger had not. Winter settled slowly over Dunwich, drifting across the valley with thick gray clouds and a hush that seemed deeper than in previous years. The quiet was not only seasonal, it was psychological. The people went about their daily tasks with the practiced motion of those who wished to forget, yet their eyes always drifted toward the hills when the wind grew too still or when shadows lengthened across the fields. Something had happened there, something no mortal tongue could fully articulate, and though the immediate danger was gone, the echo of it lingered like an aftertaste in the air. To outsiders, Dunwich appeared unchanged. A rural, aging village, tucked away beyond the well-traveled roads, its farms weathered by time and poverty. But those who lived there recognized the subtle differences. A certain stiffness crept into conversations. A certain hesitancy colored every action. A certain vigilance sharpened the senses. Even the animals behaved differently. Cattle gathered closer to their barns at dusk, and the dogs barked less frequently, as though afraid of waking something that should remain asleep. In the weeks following the calamity, Armitage had maintained steady correspondence with several villagers who trusted him. They reported that the hills were quieter, the rumblings had ceased, and no further damage had been done. Yet, despite these positive signs, Armitage felt no relief. He had studied the diary, the rituals, the cosmic laws behind the Whateleys' madness. He understood better than anyone that the true danger had never been the creature alone, but the knowledge that produced it. Knowledge, once released into the world, is difficult to extinguish. At Miskatonic University, Armitage took careful steps to ensure that the worst texts were secured beyond reach, locked away where only a handful of trusted scholars could access them. The Necronomicon, in particular, he guarded with renewed vigilance, knowing that it held formulae far more destructive than the rites Wilbur Whateley had attempted. If someone else, an ambitious student, a rogue academic, or simply a fool, were to tamper with its instructions, the consequences could be catastrophic. But even as he strengthened the university's restrictions, Armitage knew he could not guard every corner of the world. There were other texts scattered in private libraries, forgotten monasteries, underground collections works that whispered of the old ones and described ways to open the gates between worlds. And more troubling still, there were those who would seek such knowledge on purpose, believing themselves chosen or enlightened enough to wield it. These individuals were, in Armitage's estimation, far more dangerous than any mindless beast. His thoughts returned often to Wilbur himself, brilliant, monstrous Wilbur, who from infancy could decipher ancient languages and perform rituals with precision. Had Wilbur been born human, perhaps his intellect would have bloomed into something magnificent. Instead, it had been twisted into a tool of annihilation. Yet Armitage could not deny the tragedy at the heart of it all. Wilbur, for all his cunning and horror, had never truly belonged to this world. He had been shaped for a purpose he had not chosen. Dunwich, too, carried scars. The villagers rebuilt fences and barns where they could, patched roofs, replaced shattered windows. But the psychological damage was harder to mend. Some of the older families moved away quietly, feeling the land had become tainted. Others stayed out of stubbornness or necessity, but lived with an unspoken fear. The Whateley farmhouse was left to collapse on its own, avoided by all. Children dared each other to run near it, but no one ever stepped inside. Too many stories clung to those ruins, and even the bravest felt watched by unseen forces when they ventured too close. Late one afternoon, as the first snow dusted the hills, Curtis Whateley visited the ruins alone. He had not meant to, but something had drawn him there, a desire to face the truth of his family's legacy. The mangled boards still showed the marks of whatever had burst from the upper room. The ground bore faint depressions, all that remained of the creature's early movements. Curtis stood in silence, staring at the desolation, and finally whispered a trembling vow. No Whateley will ever call on such things again. But even as he spoke, he wondered whether such promises could bind a family whose history reached back into the oldest shadows of the valley. Meanwhile, in Arkham, Armitage experienced unsettling dreams. In some, he stood once more upon Sentinel Hill, chanting against the wind. In others, he saw cracks spreading across the sky, widening until stars fell out or changed their shapes entirely. Sometimes he heard Wilbur's voice calling from beyond a veil, pleading in tones that wavered between human and monstrous. And sometimes he heard the deeper cry, the echo of the creature's desperate call for its father. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, unsure whether the dream had been a memory or a warning. Morgan and Rice fared no better. Morgan grew quieter, abandoning several research projects and refusing to attend social gatherings. Rice took to long, solitary walks, sometimes returning to his office with scribbled notes about geometric distortions he believed he saw in shadows cast by the library windows. They had survived, yes, but they were changed. The unseen world had brushed against them, leaving fingerprints on their minds. Still, life continued. The seasons shifted. Snow turned to mud, mud to new grass, and the valley's rhythms returned with deceptive gentleness. But Dunwich no longer felt like a forgotten rural pocket. It felt like a place that had stood on the edge of a cosmic precipice and somehow pulled itself back without falling in. Occasionally, travelers passing through would remark on the strange quiet of the hills, but the locals offered only vague explanations. Old storms, they might say. Shifts in the rocks. None spoke of the truth. Not because they had agreed to hide it, but because they sensed instinctively that such truths should never be spoken. To articulate them would lend them power. To remember them too clearly might invite them back. Armitage understood this unspoken pact. He himself withheld every detail in his published accounts, reducing the entire event to a single footnote of local disturbances. But in private, he continued his work, studying, guarding, preparing. He did not believe the danger had ended, only paused. One evening, standing alone in his study, he whispered into the quiet, "The world will not know what came so close, and perhaps it should not, but we who know must remain vigilant." He closed the last of his texts and extinguished the lamp. Outside, the night wind rustled against the window panes, carrying with it the faintest, most distant echo of something ancient and forgotten, like a memory of a voice calling from across the stars. It faded quickly, but Armitage heard it, and he knew better than to think the cosmos had gone silent forever. The Dunwich Horror remains one of H.P. Lovecraft's most chilling explorations of cosmic fear, an unsettling reminder that the universe holds forces far older, stranger, and more indifferent than mankind can comprehend. Through the rise of Wilbur Whateley, the terror growing in the boarded upper room, and the near-apocalyptic breach on Sentinel Hill, Lovecraft paints a world where ancient knowledge and human ambition intersect with devastating consequences. What makes the tale unforgettable is not only the monstrous entity itself, but the realization that its existence was made possible by human curiosity and desperation. Dunwich becomes a symbol of forgotten places where old secrets sleep, of the fragility of reality, and of the thin veil protecting us from cosmic chaos. Yet at its heart, this story is also about resistance, the refusal of Dr. Armitage and his colleagues to surrender to fear, their willingness to confront the unimaginable, and their determination to close the door between worlds, even when the cost is nearly unbearable. It reminds us that courage does not always mean victory. It means standing firm when the darkness rises. If you enjoyed this deep retelling and exploration of one of Lovecraft's most iconic works, make sure to subscribe to Havelin Storytime. Join us for more haunting narratives, rich analyses, and journeys into the strange, the mysterious, and the beautifully terrifying worlds of classic literature. Don't forget to like, comment, and share. Your support helps bring more timeless stories to life.